Good afternoon. What's going on? So, doing a little sharpening on one of my rip saws. I want to talk a little bit about tooth geometry. Because I'm working on a project doing my bandsaws for the new Norwood HD36 V2. And I want to talk about how the geometry crosses and how and what you're trying to do when you're sharpening, because I've been working on sharpening the bandsaw blades. And I think it's important when, especially if you go into a DIY standpoint of setting up a sharpener, I think it's important to understand the geometry and what you're trying to accomplish. We'll talk a little bit about tooth geometry here, which this rip configuration saw right here is very similar to a bandsaw blade. And I do have a machine to do this. Just takes me half the time to do it by hand. Oh, I'm going to back you up a little bit. This is going to get a little bit in depth. So if you're into tooth geometry, great. If you're not, go find something else to watch. Get you backed up a little bit here so you can see what's going on. And then I'll get you a close-up of the teeth. And then I'm going to do a couple of diagrams here, but the important part when I'm checking right now is that I'm getting all the way up to, I don't know if you can see that, how that's ripping apart my fingernail. Just making sure that I've hit everything. And it is, for me, I have my file set up so that my thumb is straight on the top right now. This is, if you're into sawmills, there we go, and bandsaw blades, I promise you that this is going to be important. What I'm making sure is that I've hit every tooth all the way. What I'm sharpening these at right now is 0 rate. And on your bandsaw blades, it's going to be more like for a standard bandsaw blade, something like 7 degrees for a see, like your Ripper 7 and say 10 for softwoods, and we're going to get into all that. So what's happening right now is that the back side of my file is setting my rake angle, which is straight up and down. It's 0 rake. And on a rip saw like this, 0 rake makes it a little bit harder to push, but it removes a lot of material. Now on a bandsaw blade, what we do is we set them at positive rake, which is great because it removes material faster, and we have the power in the engine to push it. In a handsaw like this, and these are crazy sharp right now, in a handsaw like this, you wouldn't have the power to push it at 0 rake. Not at positive rake. So, 0 rake is as much as really the power to push. So 0 rake actually removes the most material. The fastest, but it's very hard to start. So if you're not a good sawyer, you should go with negative rake. A little bit, 5 degrees or so. 5 degrees would be something like that. And I'm pretty good at sawing, so as a sawyer, so I go with 0 rake. And this is going to cross over the bandsaws really quick. Just give me a second to rock through the rest of this. Doesn't take very long. Just making sure that I get all the way up to every tip. This is set just like the bandsaw blade, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it's important to understand the geometry of what you're trying to accomplish, especially if you're getting into making a DIY sharpener and setter, which is what I'm working on right now. Setting up a sharpening system for my bandsaw blades. But your bandsaw does basically the same thing that this saw does. And that is that rips across the grain, tears out chunks like little chisels. And as opposed to cross-cutting, these teeth are sharpened with 0 fleam. Fleam is this angle here, and I'm going to show you down from the top in a second, but I don't want to lose my spot. And I've done this so many times that I'm actually kind of good at it. Put my thumb right on the top to keep my 0 rake on the back. Give you a little demonstration of those too in a second. This is a maintenance sharpening, not setting the teeth here. A pretty good set on the saw. But we're going to talk about that in a second too. Wow, that tooth's messed up. good to graduate these teeth off a little bit and let them roll out like this to the tip to get you started. All right, so sharp all the way across. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a good look at this, and we're going to talk a little bit about geometry and what we're trying to accomplish when we sharpen something, because I think it's important to understand that first. What we're trying to do. I'll throw a piece of wood up in here and rip it too by hand. I'll show you my tooth line here. So I don't know if you can see. That's obviously sharp. See the tooth line all sharpened up. Let's talk a little bit about geometry. I hope you find this interesting. And it is important. Oops. Get that down through that thing. So, if you picture this as this is a rip configuration. And what a rip configuration is that we have zero rake. This is your rake angle right here. Get a little closer. I know there's going to be some parallax the way I have it configured here, but this is your rake angle, and I'm going to draw it for you in a second. And the rake angle dictates how aggressive your tooth cuts. And then what makes this a rip configuration is that every tooth is filed straight across. Now you can see some lines on this tape on the top. Those lines are at 20 degrees. And those lines are there for a visual guide for me when I'm filing crosscut saws, so that I can put flame on these teeth, which angles this cutter edge this way or this way on the next tooth, and then this way on this tooth. And that creates a sharp, almost like a knife edge on the teeth. Rip teeth are not that way. Rip teeth are filed straight across at 90 degrees, just like your bandsaw. And what they do is, as they go across the grain, they rip out, that's why they're called rip teeth, chunks of wood across the grain. As you can imagine, going across a handful of straws, they tear through the grain and they rip out little chunks. And then those chunks move down into the gullet here and get carried through the cut. And then they eject out the far end when you're cutting. And the bigger that these gullets are, the more sawdust they can hold as they get ripped across. So let's rip something with this really quick to show you kind of how it works. And then we're going to go to the piece of paper and we'll draw up some geometry and stuff like that. But let me get you kind of over here. I'm going to take that out of my homemade little wooden saw vise here. And we'll rip a piece of wood really quick. Now, like I said, there are many different angles to deal with. If you're not a very good sawyer with a handsaw, I am, then you probably want to add a little negative rake. It makes it easier to do for you. And for me, I want to take the most material out that I possibly can. Sorry, I'm looking for a piece of wood here. The most material out that I possibly can. in the shortest amount of time. And like I said, I'm pretty good at sawing, so I will file them at 0. This is about 1 3/4 wide, which doesn't really matter, but I'm not going to draw a line on here. It doesn't really matter as far as that goes, but maybe I can just to show that we could come down the side also. Just get my finger right. And what happens with the saw is what you can see. Let me just make sure. Yeah, it looks like you're pretty good there. What happens with the saw, get some wood on the floor here to go 2 hands on it, is that you support the saw with the bottom of the horn here, with the bottom of your hand, by actually holding it up so that it can start. And if you don't do this, you would just, if you didn't do that, if you just held on to the grip like this and tried to start, it would just bite in and you wouldn't be able to. So there is some technique to getting it to start cutting like this. And as we get into the cut here, right now, nice and smooth, items in front of anything. You can rip through some, fairly thick material pretty quickly. I want to bend my saw. You can really go at it if you want. Go heat to it and rip yourself a line fairly quickly. And this is something that I have to be able to do as a joiner, obviously, to follow lines. You can see just staying just outside that line on the way down. So this is what ripsaw does. The more rake, we'll do some drawing here, that you have on that tooth, more positive rake that you do on it, towards positive rake that you do on that tooth, the faster that happens. So on a bandsaw blade, we have our bandsaw band like this, and we have our teeth. Let's see if I can draw this right. Which way do I want to go? So here's a tooth and a gullet. Okay, so this is what our bandsaw blade looks like. So if you take a perpendicular line from here, this is 0 degrees. That is what my handsaw here is sharpened at, 0 degrees. Our line up the tooth like this is our rake. That is our rake angle. And let's just say a general purpose rake angle, if you cut hardwood and softwood and everything else, is around, let's just call it 7 degrees. A strictly softwood rake angle like that is around 10 degrees. And a hardwood rake angle, less aggressive, is somewhere around 4 or 5 degrees. So let's call this hardwood. Let's call this soft. Easiest wood to cut, hardest wood to cut, somewhere in the middle. 5 degree rake angle, 7 degree rake angle for the middle, which is what most people use. And then 10 degree rake angle, which is more softwood specific. This is aggressive. And this is more, let's just call it mild. I don't know what I would call less aggressive. I run 7 degree bands. They're in the middle of these two, and they give me the best cross between the two. It's not a great softwood angle, and it's not a great hardwood angle, but it gives me the best match between the two for cutting both. Now, there isn't a lot of differences, and we're going to go upstairs in a second and look at bands, but there isn't a lot of difference between these two. It's only a minor adjustment in the tilt of your sharpening system to adjust that angle to 5 or to 10. It's very, very small adjustment. And what we do is, as our sharpening wheel comes down and it grinds through the gullet profile here, and this is your gullet right here, and what this does is this fills up with sawdust. And the depth of that gullet is how much sawdust that can carry, and then as the band direction is going this way, it tosses that sawdust out your chute. The deeper that these gullets are, the more sawdust they can carry. And in your hardwood cutting, that's going to be more dust, more real fine particulates, because it's not going to rip off big chunks. And then over here in your more aggressive cutting, that's going to be really big chunks of curls and so on and so forth of softwood. And that gullet becomes much, much more important on the softwood side than it is on the hardwood side. On the hardwood side, you're filling it up with dust. On the softwood side, you're filling it up with chunks and curls. Kind of like, if you can imagine ripping with a chainsaw, when you pull out noodles, which is a little different than ripping cross grain. So what happens is, if you can imagine a handful of straws like this, which is what your wood looks like. These are your wood pores. This is what an end grain of wood looks like. It's little circles, little straws that go down the wood like that. When you're ripping through these this way, you're cutting across the circles. Okay, so your band is cutting across them like that. And you're only tearing out these little sections of the cell wall as it cuts across. When you're cross-cutting them, they look more like this. When you're cross-cutting them going this way, you're tearing through wider bands, and those are the chips that fling out of your chainsaw. Cutting through wider bands of those, and those chips break off because they're only this big. And then when you're what's called noodling, if you've ever heard that term, where you're ripping out big noodles, people call that ripping, and it's really it's a style of ripping. When you're noodling, the reason why people will say, well, when you're ripping with a chainsaw, you should be ripping out big noodles. No, that's not true. But when you're noodling, you're cutting with your saw this way. Here's your saw. And your teeth are going in and they're tearing off this whole section right here. And that is your noodle that's getting spit out the saw and curling up into that big ass noodle. So when you're doing this, you're getting dust because you're only tearing off this teeny little chunk of the cell wall. That's all that's coming off. And when you're cross-cutting, you're tearing off chips because you're taking a cross section of that cell wall with your chain, and that's what's tearing off. And then when you're noodling, which is cutting along the grain this way, this is across the grain, this is along the grain, this is across the cells. So this is across the grain, but it's across the cells. This is along the grain ripping, and you're tearing out noodles. What you want in your bandsaw blade is you want your bandsaw blade to be sharp and specific to be the most efficient for what you're cutting. So if you're cutting hardwoods all the time, you should keep that rake angle down. It's going to give you the most durable tip. As this tip, let's do this. So here's your gullet, okay? As you take this point and you file it back this way, which is positive rake, the more positive rake that you make, so here's your rake line to your bottom line. The more positive rake that you make, the thinner you make this tip. The less that you make that, let's do something that's like 3 or 4. Let's see if I can draw this right. The thicker you make that tip. When you're cutting hardwood, that tip is thicker and it's going to resist rolling over into rolling that tip off. When you have a lot of positive rake here, say, let's just say 10 degrees, and this is, let's just say 4 degrees, that tip gets very, very thin, which is why I use it in softwood, because the tip is less durable. It will cut faster, but because it's less durable, it's not going to get knocked over and rounded off as easy in softwood as it will in hardwood. If you tried to run a 10-degree band in hardwood, what's going to happen is you're going to wipe this tip off really quick. That's why you go over to 4 degrees. Or 3 degrees, or you could even, I haven't seen this in bandsaw blades, but you go to 0 degrees like my handsaw here. So if you look at my handsaw, see if I can get you, hold on, I'm going to pick the phone up really quick so I can get you down close. You see my handsaw here. You can see on the tip of my finger there at how thick that tip is, the more that I file that rake back this way, which would be positive rake. Right now it's at 0, straight up and down. The more I file it back this way, the thinner that tip gets and the less resistant it's going to be to rolling over. So the reason that, sorry about this, the reason that you go to less aggressive hook angle on hardwoods is to resist wiping this tip off. If your blade was ultimately strong, if your band was ultimately strong, 10 degrees will cut faster if you have the power to push it through. In hardwood, it will shear off and remove more material faster in hardwood than a 4-degree will. This would cut faster. The problem is that the tip can't take it. The tip is going to wipe off and get dull, and then this will stop cutting. So that's the reason that we go down to like 4 degrees, 5 degrees, is so that this tip will stay sharp longer. Won't stay sharp forever, but it'll stay sharp longer than in 10 degrees. That's the reason for the variation in your rake angles on your bandsaw blades. So what we're going to do is we're going to go upstairs. We're going to look at what I'm working on. And I think this geometry lesson. So, and we might as well do this too. Let's talk about rip teeth and crosscut teeth. And this crosses over to chainsaw chains too. But a rip tooth looks like this. I'm not doing a very good isometric drawing here, but this is straight across the plate, 0 degrees. And this is the back side of the tooth here. Your cutting edge is filed at 0. On a crosscut tooth, your cutting edge has what's called fleam. So, see the best way to draw this. It's a facet to where there's a knife edge on the tooth. If I look down on the top of it, it would look like sorry, I'm having trouble drawing this, but if you look down on top of it, it would look, grab one, so it's going to be easier for me to grab a saw and show you. One that's got big teeth on it. Hold on. Grab my Simmons here. Nope, that's not it. Here. I'm going to grab my Simmons here. So this is a very, very big crosscut saw. I'm going to get behind the camera and show you. It's a very big crosscut saw. Timber joinery crosscut saw. The teeth are filed, at an angle to the top plate. And what they do is they create a knife edge. So this one's leaning away, this one's leaning in. This one's leaning away, this one's leaning in, but the file goes through it at an angle like this and like this. Where on the crosscut, the the rip saw, the file goes straight across like that. Just like, this is just like a chainsaw chain. So each one of these teeth are angled, depending on the wood you cut, different angles, but angled like this and like that and like this and like that. And they create a knife edge. As you can see there, this is way better than I can draw it. They create a knife edge like you see there. And that knife edge goes the other way here, and obviously it's leaning in here. They go, so on this tooth, goes that way, and on the next tooth, it goes that way. That's the difference between crosscut and rip. On our bandsaw blades, they are rip blades. So we're going to go upstairs. Take a walk through the house here. And that's my saw till over there. Of course, you got the plane till up here, but I apologize if I bump into anything. I'll show you what I'm working on, and the reason that this is applicable is that you have to understand these geometries when you do stuff to understand what you're trying to do. You don't see this talked about much. Just see that people, you know, grab a grinder. And this is my chainsaw building room. Got all kinds of saws under here, timing wheel, a whole new kit saw under there, but saws under here. I work on chainsaws up here. I do have a router table and a downdraft table. We use this as a finishing room also too. This is a 4x8 bench up here. And when we're doing larger panels, we can do all our finish work up here, glue up, finishing, so on and so forth. But we'll talk a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish here. I'll get some light on this for you too. As much light as I can. So what we're doing here, I'm going to sit in front of you, make sure you get a good view, is that we are trying to come up with a system that consistently cuts a specific rake angle, which is this angle on the teeth. Let me take this out of here for 1 second. Get my pressure off and take this out of here so I can show you. I can go up. I'll go with my dip cup. So this is your rake angle. And these teeth are filed straight across. They are a rip configuration. This rip angle that I'm reproducing on sharpening this, and this one has been sharpened, and it is ridiculously sharp as I'm setting up my system here. This rake angle right here is 7 degrees, and that's what I'm running on my bands for a cross between softwood and hardwood. You want that consistent, and you want this gullet profile to remain the same. So you don't want to just come in and kiss off on the tooth and let this gullet get smaller and smaller and smaller. And as you can imagine, like I was talking about before, if you, this is 7 degrees, that's showing you your rake angle. If we got this over to 10, let's just crank it over to 10, which is not a very big change. But if you got this over to 10, what you're doing is you're thinning out that tooth. You're making it up on top where the business end of the tooth where it does the cutting. You're making it thinner because you're cutting this line right here back like that more. And that's not very much. So as you can see, hopefully it shows up on camera good. you can see the difference between 7 and 10 right there. And as I bring this over, if I cut this at 10, you can see that I'm removing material from here and I'm making this tooth thinner. And this tooth is going to get wiped out faster that way. I hope that illustrates what I was talking about downstairs as far as the durability, the reason why we sharpen a 10 or 7 or 4 or 5 or whatever. And you can try anything you want. Now what I'm doing here is I'm modifying. I have a stone that's ground off to the profile of the gullet. Let's see if I can get, this isn't going to show up very well, but you know, I'm going to take you out of the holder here so you can see this. Hopefully you don't shut it off. Wow, I'm already 40 minutes into this. Holy shit. Tooth geometry. So this stone is ground at the profile of the gullet. You can see that right there. So when I come down, I grind the gullet, the complete gullet to the profile of that stone. And I hit that front edge. So it comes down, it grinds the front edge, and also takes out the gullet at the same time. So you can see, it all. Let me get a better, angle. You can see how the gullets have all been ground out. Now, what I'm trying to do is right now I'm trying to reduce chatter in my setup. Now, I know that a lot of you have got automatic sharpeners and so on and so forth, and hopefully this will allow you to understand what you're doing versus just, you know, setting it so that it just barely kisses the tooth and grinds it, and you set it on automatic go and it just goes and you go back to cutting. Hopefully this lets you understand so that you can start to change these angles and modify what you're doing so that you can cut different wood. But what I'm doing right now is I've got a few problems with this grinder. Number one, let's get this knob on the back side of the grinder here, and I have to pull this over to cinch down on these plates to hold this rigidly. And what I have to do is I have to keep my hand under here and reef down on it. And for those of you who don't have something to tension down on the blade, I don't know if you can see how much this is moving, but it moves a lot. So whatever gap that you get in between your two plates here, if you're making one on your own or whatever, there's going to be flex in this blade unless you can cinch down on it. Like we have a parabolic cam in the back here that cinches down tight on this so I can barely move it. But I have a lot of stick up here, and as a machinist I know that that's not good. That's going to make resonance and this is going to vibrate, and that's not going to make the cleanest cut. So what I'm working on is I'm going to replace these with plate to come up to just below the gullet here, so I can grind them and it holds it more rigidly, holds the band more rigidly. But I want to keep my system of cinching down on it, and I don't want to have to reach in here anymore, like under here, to do it. So I've actually come up with, drill the hole through this, I think this is 5/8 steel I used to use for tool rests on my lathe. I've come up with a system to where I can do this from out here. So I can back it off, move it to the next tooth, cinch it down. Sorry, it's moving right now because it's not clamped tight, but I can back it off, move it to the next tooth, cinch it down, cut my tooth. This obviously is our stop so that we're cutting the same off of every tooth. And I'm modifying my system right now, but now I've got this so I can do it from out here. I'm probably going to put the knob on this like that. I'm going to cut this down on the lathe and thread it so that the knob will go on here. And then I've got a couple of nuts so that I can put one on both sides of that 5/8 steel so it holds it in place. But right now I can just kind of set it out of the way. I can use it just like this. So that was my first modification. My next modification is to take this track out of here and make one out of plate. There's scraps that I had lying around that are the same thickness as this, or pretty close. And I will make them taller so that they come up here so they support the blade more rigidly and for a longer, probably take the smallest one of these that I have left, is this one. So I'll probably make them approximately that long. So it supports the blade for a longer distance and it cuts down on vibration. You know, even if you cinch down on this and I reach up here and I can't move it. I mean, it's solid, but when this wheel's spinning and it goes in there, it's making this vibrate. So I want to take the vibration out of it. It'll cut more efficiently that way, and it will cut cleaner that way, and it will cut more accurately that way so that this isn't moving around. Also, another part of this is that the reason that you have to set these teeth before you go to grinding on them is because when you come down in here and you grind this, you knock a burr on the backside. And if you feel on the back side of this right now, there's a burr all on the backside. The top side is smooth. I mean, the front side's smooth, and the back side has a burr all the way along. And a burr is just a little hook of metal that gets ground off the backside. And what happens on this tooth is that burr comes off the backside, and it's a few thousandths thick. So if you grind this first and then you go to setting, that burr will affect the dial indicator. Whatever setting tool you use, that burr will affect this dial indicator as far as how much set you have on the tooth. And it will show you a false reading as far as what the actual backside of this tooth is. Now, when you're setting it over with that burr, the set's the set. So if you set it over 22 thousandths, which is basically half the thickness of this blade, this is like 42 thousandths, and if you so you should set it over 21 and a half. But if you set it over 22 thousandths and you have that burr on the backside, you are setting 22 thousandths, but what's going to happen is as you run it through the wood, that burr is going to come off, and then you're going to have 3 thousandths less set on the back than on the front. And if you have an entire backside of this blade that's set 3 thousandths less than the other side's taking out more wood, and that can cause your blade, it's going to cause your blade to do this. One side of the blade is taking more wood, so it's constantly going to be loading, and then your guides are going to knock it back straight, and then it's going to unevenly load, and then your guides are going to knock it back straight. And even if it's a teeny little bit, so it's moving very little, if you way overset one side, then it would be like this. But if it's very close, you're still getting a little bit of movement. So your teeth are going wah, 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 the whole time. And that's giving you that uneven finish in the top. This is one thing that I've learned from chainsaw milling for so long is sharpening my teeth. If I do a perfect job with my rakers and my teeth, I will get a really smooth finish. If you don't pay attention to all those parts and your blade's doing this the whole time, you're going to get a very washboard kind of finish. I've taken a lot of time sharpening, setting, and deburring. and going back. So what happens when you grind this? You knock a burr over the top side of this tooth. I actually go in with a diamond and grind the back side of that tooth off, take that burr right off. So there is no burr on the tooth. That seems like overkill to most. So most are going to say, no, I just grind it and I go back to work and I cut great. Well, that's true. But what happens with that burr is it rips off. And when that burr rips off, that's why I grab a piece of plate steel here, probably draw you a picture. What happens when that burr rips off? So actually you can see a burr right here. See this right here. See this piece of metal. When this was cut the other day, I was making some doors, rounded, tapered doors for a high-end flower show in Connecticut. And I had to make a metal skeleton, weld it together at a radius. And I was cutting these off, and this is similar to a burr. Now this is just a piece that wasn't cut, but this is similar to a burr. What happens is that burr bends back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and then it tears off like that. All right, and it's gone. When it tears off, if you can imagine a nice, perfectly machined edge, okay, with this burr sticking off the backside, that's a little hook, okay? When that burr tears off, it ends up making that nice, perfectly machined edge look like this, like a sawtooth. That's where you start to get dull. So the burr rips off first, and in the beginning it cuts great because that burr is helping it dig in. So if you can imagine trying to push this burr into the wood here, hopefully you can see this. If you imagine trying to push that burr into the wood, the burr will dig in, right? It digs in, and it'll dig in more than the other side that doesn't have it. That burr will dig in, and as you start cutting, you say, holy shit, this band's great. Because the burr's ripping into the wood and it's cutting really fast and it's ripping off chunks. And then when that burr finally, especially if you're cutting hardwood, when that burr finally tears off and it leaves you that little jagged edge because it's ripping off metal with it, that jagged edge gets rounded over. So your nice square edge of your tooth that has a burr that looks like this, when that burr tears off, it leaves a jagged edge here. And then what happens is your tooth rounds over. So your edge will go dull faster. All right, I'm going to get this thing on my face here so I can make this, because this is important. Grab a piece of wood so I can illustrate a little better. Get 9,000 pieces of wood in here. So right here, you got a nice clean piece of wood. This was obviously cut with a miter saw. You can see the radial marks in it. A nice clean piece of wood here. If this was your edge of your tooth, it'd be at an angle like that. And you have your burr hanging over the top. Or in the case of grinding the tooth, the burr would be back like this, be up top here. When that burr rips off, it's going to leave a jagged edge. Instead of this nice clean edge here, it's going to leave a jagged edge when that burr rips off. Now it's very, very small. We're talking about a bandsaw blade, so it's very, very small, and you're talking about a real small edge. But that jagged edge, so here you get your tooth. When you grind it, you get this nice clean edge with a little burr sticking off the top like that. When that burr rips off, it leaves a jagged edge. And then what happens is that tooth rounds over. So you can imagine side view like that. Eventually, because you get all those little jagged ridges in there, that rounds over. And that's when your blade gets dull. And that's when you have to start pushing on it. This corner right here ends up like this. Ends up rounded over. And instead of digging in and cutting, it gets round. And you have to start pushing on it, and it starts singing different, and it starts slowing down. You start creating different dust. And your bandsaw blade slows down. Now, you haven't wrecked it yet. You just have this nice sharp tooth here that would just tear into my thumbnail. That's just ripping off noodles off my thumbnail here. That edge is just rounded, and it cuts less efficiently like that. So I actually, in my setup, I go through one time with a little diamond hone right here, and I just kiss the burr off the top of the teeth, and it becomes exponentially sharper. Now, you don't, what I could do is I could set my grinder so that I could set my, hold on, get tension off it. I could set my grinder, because of the angle on the stone, to this right here, and set my depth stop so that it comes down and just barely kisses the top of that tooth and grinds it off too. And then I'd have to go one at a time. But to be honest with you, it's faster for me just to grab this diamond hone and just go across like that and just wipe the burr off real quick. Is it overkill? In the world of sawmilling, there are production sawmills out there that are 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times more than I am. And they're tearing through wood all day. They might, you know, a production sawyer, this is ridiculously sharp too. A production sawyer might go through 4 or 5 bands a day. For most of us, you know, if we use 1 band a day, we say, holy shit, that's a lot. Well, part of cutting down on that need to replace bands all the time is to work with the proper geometry. So if we're cutting softwood, you know, we can go to 10, but it's going to dull quicker. Or you can stick with 7 like I do. So it's going to be the best middle of the road. And the other things that I can do to keep this from getting dull faster is to knock that burr off the top so that I don't end up with that sawtooth edge as it starts to wear. And this band will last longer. So I'm marking them, and it's kind of a new process for me, but I'm marking my bands. This means that it was sharpened and set, because when I went through and checked this band, the set was pretty good. It was within 2,000ths, the entire band from the factory, before I sharpened it. Didn't need to be set, but I did take, unfortunately on this one band, it was 25 thousandths on one side, 23 thousandths on the other. That to me means this. You at the 25,000 side is taking a bigger cut. It's taking more wood for every single tooth on this band. So the 25 thousandths is going to dig in, and then the guides on the band are going to make it go back, and then it's going to dig in and go back. But when you're within 2,000ths, that modulation is very, 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 very small. So it's still cutting pretty smooth. So, you know, your finish is still coming out really nice. Where you get those big, huge undulations in your cut is either when you have teeth that are way out of spec. Let's say you have one that was 8 thousandths out of spec. So I had 23 thousandths on one side and 31 on the other, which is not uncommon. I was watching, rather than calling him out, one of the sawyers who's made a YouTube channel out of it. and has a lot of followers and is monetized and makes money. He was going through with his new Cook's setter, and one side of his band was set at 32 thousandths and the other side was set down to 22, 23. And that was a new Cook's band. That's going to go like this a lot. That 32 thousandths is going to dig in, and then the guides are going to knock it back straight. And then it's going to dig in, and it's going to knock it back straight. Hundreds of times, a cut, I don't want to say a second because I'd have to start doing math, but many, 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 many times during the cut. And it's creating a very washboard effect. And what he did was he had just got a new Cook setter and a new Cook sharpener, and he was trying to show that he had a nail strike, and he was trying to show the difference between the nail strike band before and after. And then when he went in and he ran it through the setter, he's like, oh, 32,000, so I'll just leave it at that, because he didn't really know the setter very well. And then he went back out and cut, and the finish looked the same. The nail strike band cut just as washboard as after he set and sharpened it. And that was because of the set. Well, what I'm doing, this entire band right now is set within 1,000th. My max is 24 and my minimum is 23. This entire band, every tooth on this band, both directions, is set within 1,000th of an inch. When I put this on my mill, given the fact that my tracking's right and the guides are right and everything else, this is going to cut ridiculously smooth. And because it's so sharp, because I've knocked the burr off and ground it and everything else, it's going to cut ridiculously fast. If you watch Hobby Hardwoods, Alabama, Robert Milton, the guy he was an engineer in his former life. He's a genius. He cuts insanely good wood. He talks about the rooster tail that, a blade kicks out, and he can tell within the first 5 feet of a cut whether a band's any good or not, even if it's brand new. And he has bands that he uses because they work, and bands that people send him bands and say, try this, and he can go 5 foot into a log and say, this band's junk. And that's all because of set. If you're overset on one side, what it does is it kicks that rooster tail up or down. And he can tell by the way that the sawdust is ripping out of the kerf before it goes through your chute, right at the edge of the log where the sawdust is ripping out of the chute, and he calls it the rooster tail. If that sawdust isn't coming out perfectly in line with his blade, with his band, he won't use that band. He'll take it off sharp and throw it in the rubbish. Say, this is not worth my time, because he's production hardwood sawyer, and he makes his money selling the hardwood that he processes and he produces. This band right here, the way that it's set and sharpened, is going to kick a rooster tail out that's perfectly straight. And it's going to cut really smooth. It's going to cut really fast. And my hope is, by taking off that burr on the top of these teeth, that this band's going to last a little longer than a standard band as well. So that's, I hope this helps somebody out. I hate this to jabber on, especially when I'm working like I am right now and trying to come up with a new mount system here and the whole 9 yards. I think it's important when you come up with your sharpening system, or whatever sharpening system you use, even if it's you spend $800 on a Cook sharpener, the cat claw sharpener, and you spend the money on the Cook setter, which are wonderful things. If you don't understand the geometry, it's not doing you any good. If you don't set these bands close and pay attention, it's not doing you any good. Now, can I just grab a brand new band and just go along and grind it, throw it back on the sawmill and go cut, and will it cut wood? Absolutely it will. No doubt about it. How bad is enough in rough sawn? I don't know. I want to saw pretty flat wood. I want to have fun doing it. I don't want my blade going the whole time and diving and rising and falling, and all these people, you get into, why am I cutting wavy lumber and all that. Well, it could be a myriad of reasons. It's not just my saw sucks. I got an LM29 and it doesn't cut straight. It's not just that my band's not perfectly level. It's not that my wheels aren't tracking right. It's not that my guides aren't set perfect. It's the whole 9 yards. It's from top to bottom. It's one thing that I've learned from chainsaw milling is it's top to bottom. I see people in chainsaw milling these brand new setups and they take a brand new blade out, and the comments are always the same. Well, none of my chains, what happens when I sharpen a chain, it's never as good as it was new. That's ridiculous. And I saw in one of the big sawmilling channels yesterday, a big sawmilling channel, big production sawmill, them talking about their sharpening setup and that their resharp blades are never as good as new. Well, that's just silly. That's silly. That just means they don't understand how to sharpen. Because when you put this band through this process, it should be better than new. There's no production process out there that's going to give you as close a set as I can do with a setter and a dial indicator and deburring every tooth. My band is better than it was new. Better. When I file a chainsaw chain, it is better than it was new. It's equally as sharp, and the set itself and the raker height is more uniform. I get chainsaw chains that are all over the world. I'll take my progressive raker gauge and go across them, and some, it's not even touching the depth gauge, and it's not a true raker, by the way, it's a depth gauge. The teeth on these are rakers. The middle tooth that has no set, and this band right here, like this one right here that I have my finger on, this is a raker tooth. If this band is set correctly, this raker tooth doesn't cut. All it does is clear sawdust. This tooth, the left and the right cutter, the set left and set right cutter, are cutting all the wood out of the way in front of this tooth. This tooth, all it does is take sawdust and clear sawdust from the middle of the kerf. There should be nothing left for this to cut. This one is set over 21 thousandths, so it's cutting all the wood on this side. This one's set over 21.5, 22 thousandths this way. It's cutting all the wood out of the way this way to this height. This tooth is cut at the same height. There should be no wood left for this one to cut when it goes through. All it should do is clear sawdust. Now I know that they're digging in, so there is some residual wood cutting going on here, but it's very, very minimal. This is a true raker tooth. On a chainsaw chain, it's not a raker tooth. It's not a tooth. It's not clearing sawdust. It might clear some, but it's angled back into the teeth, so it's not doing a very good job clearing. It is a depth gauge. What it does is it creates a top so that your tooth is at an angle like this, and it can only cut the difference between the top of the tooth and the top of the depth gauge, which looks kind of like that. So it creates a depth chip that tooth can take before this bumps into the wood and won't let it take anymore. So it's not a raker, it's a depth gauge. It's a depth stop. And that's meant so that this tooth, as it digs in, doesn't overpower your saw. The lower that your depth gauge, raker, drag, whatever you want to call it, the lower it is, the more wood this bites, the more power it takes to push it through, because your chainsaw chain is at an angle like that. So it doesn't just cut, it digs in. It digs into the wood like this. It grabs. And you have to have a lot of power to pull that through the wood. So what we do to moderate that is you take this depth gauge up like that, so it can only take this teeny little bit. That's a depth gauge, not a raker. These are rakers. This actually rakes out the saw kerf of sawdust. This one. This is a true raker. So when you get into, people talking about rakers, whatever you want to call them on a chainsaw chain's fine by me, I don't care. Rakers, depth gauges, drags, whatever you want to call them. But this straight tooth on this, which is every third tooth, is an actual traditional raker tooth. It rakes sawdust out of the kerf to create space so that the edge of the saw band isn't getting heated up because all the sawdust that's built up on it as it's going through the kerf. I know this was a lot of jibber jabbering. If you hung on to the end, God bless you. You really want to learn about geometry and saw blades. Hit me up with comments. Anything you disagree with, fine by me. I will answer you back. I'm going to get back at working on this. This side worked out, and I'm going to make this taller. So I cut down on my resonance here, so I get a cleaner cut. And I hope you guys are having a great day. I wanted to pump a video out. I hope this helps you understand basic tooth geometry and how they cross over from, it doesn't matter what you're using for a saw, the geometry is all the same. And the geometry is there for a reason. And that's the important part here. So if you hung on to the end, God bless you. And if you didn't, I'm not talking to you anymore, so I don't care. And let you go through your struggles. But if you have any comments, questions, anything, hit me up and I'll answer you back. But appreciate the watch. Have a great day.